Your daughter can wait outside. Family Day is for accounts in good standing, Mr. Reed. We discussed this. Before they go, Celeste, ask him why my daughter still keeps his name beside her bed after all these years. Mason Reed did not answer at first. His daughter Lily was still holding his left hand, the same hand she had covered with a paper wristband that morning and decorated with purple marker stars. On the other side of the glass doors, children were running beneath a crooked Family Day banner, while parents balanced coffee cups and paper plates and pretended not to hear what had just been said. Celeste Harrington stood in the doorway in a cream blazer that looked almost too formal for a room full of finger paint. Her voice had been quiet. That was what made it worse. She had not shouted. She had not called Mason poor. She had simply turned a balance sheet into a border and placed his 6-year-old daughter on the wrong side of it. Then the woman behind Celeste spoke. Nora Bell had arrived 10 minutes earlier as the guest Celeste most wanted to impress. Chair of the state's Early Childhood Safety Council, former pediatric trauma advocate, the woman whose signature could place Bright Harbor Daycare on a 3-year grant program large enough to erase most of its debt. And she was looking at Mason as if a door from another life had just opened. Celeste's fingers tightened around the tablet in her hand. Mason looked at Nora only once. Recognition moved through his face and disappeared. That frightened him more than Celeste's words had hurt. Because there were only a handful of people left who could connect Mason Reed, the appliance technician with cracked work boots and an overdue childcare account, to the man he had spent years trying not to be. Lily tugged his sleeve. "Daddy?" He bent slightly, forcing his voice steady. "I'm here." In his wallet were $43.18. In his truck was a service invoice he hoped would be paid by Friday. At home, under a magnet shaped like a strawberry, was a daycare statement with 2 red lines across the bottom. Past due. He had seen it. He had not ignored it. And Celeste knew that. What she did not know was why Nora Bell's daughter still kept his name beside her bed. Before noon, that question would stop being private. Before the day was over, Celeste's grant review would no longer be about money, and Mason would have to choose between protecting the small, ordinary life he had built for Lily and stepping back toward the part of himself he had buried after his wife died. 2 weeks earlier, none of them knew Family Day would become the place where those lives collided. Mason's alarm had gone off at 5:20 on a Tuesday morning. He turned it off before the second vibration because Lily was asleep on the other side of the wall. Their apartment was small enough that the kitchen light leaked beneath her bedroom door and the radiator knocked like someone tapping a spoon against pipe. On the counter sat 3 things: a box of cereal, a prescription bottle for Lily's inhaler refill, and the Bright Harbor Daycare statement. Mason opened his banking app. $187. The inhaler would cost $64 after insurance. His truck needed fuel. The daycare balance was $760, including late fees. He stared at the number long enough for the screen to dim. He had once made decisions involving collapsed floors, burning stairwells, and 10-second windows in which a wrong turn could kill someone. Yet lately the decisions that exhausted him most were smaller: gas or groceries, late fee or medicine, a Saturday repair job or Lily's school craft fair. He paid for the inhaler. Then he transferred $100 to Bright Harbor and wrote a message in the payment note. More Friday. I'm sorry. At 6:15, Lily entered the kitchen wearing one sock. She placed a folded drawing beside his coffee. It showed 2 people under an orange sun. One was tall and square. The other had purple hair because Lily had not found the brown crayon. Over them she had written, in uncertain block letters, "Me plus Dad. Always." Mason smiled. "Where's your other sock?" "I'm waiting for it to confess." He laughed quietly. For a few seconds, the statement did not exist. By 7:30, Bright Harbor was already bright with morning noise. The daycare occupied the ground floor of an old brick community building renovated with polished floors, wide windows, coated doors, and more optimism than its finances could support. Celeste Harrington stood near the check-in desk, speaking with a contractor about paint. She was not cruel by nature. That was part of what made what happened later so difficult to excuse. 3 years earlier, she had taken over Bright Harbor after her business partner and former husband walked away with unpaid vendor bills, 2 disputed loans, and enough legal damage to scare off nearly every investor. Since then, she had learned to read every empty enrollment slot as lost payroll, every unpaid invoice as a threat, and every inspection as a possible end. She had responded by becoming exact. Policies were printed, deadlines were signed, exceptions were reduced. She told herself that fairness meant treating every family the same. What she did not notice was that rules could become a way to stop seeing people. When Mason signed Lily in, Celeste stepped toward him. "Mr. Reed," he knew the tone. "I sent what I could, 100, for now." Celeste kept her voice courteous. "You're entering your second month past due. I know. We discussed a plan. My transmission job canceled. Customer sold the machine instead of repairing it. This is childcare, not appliance service. I can't run it on maybe." Mason felt the familiar heat rise behind his ribs. Not anger exactly. Shame often arrived wearing anger's coat. He kept his hands loose. "He'll get you more Friday." Celeste glanced toward Lily, who was showing another child the purple star wristband she had made for her father. "Family Day is next week," Celeste said. "I need your account current before then." Mason looked back at her. "Lily's been talking about it for a month." "I understand." "Do you?" Celeste's expression tightened. Mason heard his own tone and regretted it instantly. He exhaled. "Sorry." That wasn't fair. The apology surprised her. Most parents behind on payment came with arguments prepared. Mason came with tired eyes and a willingness to absorb more embarrassment than Celeste understood. She lowered the tablet. "I can give you until the morning of Family Day, but I cannot keep making private exceptions. If other families discover it, I lose control of the policy." Mason nodded. "Thank you." As he turned, Lily ran back and threw her arms around his waist. "You're coming next Thursday, right?" Mason looked over her head at Celeste, then down at his daughter. "Wouldn't miss it." He meant it. That promise would become the most expensive thing he said all week. Mason spent the next 9 days trying to turn hours into money. He repaired a restaurant dishwasher before sunrise, replaced a failed compressor in a florist's cooler after closing, and crawled beneath a laundromat dryer while Lily sat 10 feet away at a folding table doing spelling homework under fluorescent light. He did not like bringing her on jobs. He disliked the look people gave him when they saw a child beside a service case. But the after-hours sitter wanted $22 an hour, and Mason was beginning to understand that poverty was full of small fees charged for the privilege of trying to escape it. At the laundromat, Lily drew while he worked. "Dad? Yeah? Were you ever scared of loud noises?" Mason stopped turning the wrench. The dryer drum ticked as it cooled. "What kind of loud noises?" "Like alarms." He looked toward her. Lily had inherited her mother's way of asking questions that sounded casual until the second sentence. "Sometimes." Mom hated smoke alarms. Mason lowered his eyes. "She hated when I burned toast." "That too." Lily smiled, but only for a second. Mason returned to the dryer. He had not told her much about the years before she was born. She knew he had worked in rescue. She knew there had been a red jacket in a box he never opened. She knew her mother, Hannah, used to say he could sleep through thunder but wake up when a stranger coughed. What Lily did not know was that Mason had once served on Metro Urban Search and Rescue Task Force 6. He had been a rescue specialist and emergency medical technician attached to a structural collapse unit. Earthquakes, fires, building failures, industrial accidents. He had spent 12 years training for moments most people prayed never came. Then, 6 years earlier, a winter apartment fire had trapped a mother and 2 children above a collapsed stairwell. Mason had gone in with a 3-person team. He came out carrying an 8-year-old girl named Emma Bell. The girl had smoke burns along one arm, a fractured wrist, and a purple plastic bracelet on which someone had written an emergency contact number. She survived. Her mother survived. Her younger brother did not. Mason never forgot the weight of that child against his chest. Nora Bell never forgot the man carrying her. Months later, Mason received a commendation. He put it in a drawer. 3 years after that fire, while he was on a storm deployment 2 counties away, Hannah Reed suffered an aneurysm in their kitchen. A neighbor found her. By the time Mason reached the hospital, she was gone. He had spent 12 years arriving in time for strangers. He had been too far away for his wife. Logic told him those facts were not connected. Grief did not care about logic. Mason resigned from the task force 7 months later. He trained as an appliance technician because machines failed for reasons that could usually be found, parts could usually be ordered, and repair schedules ended at dinner. More importantly, Lily would know he came home. That was his promise. And promises Mason had learned, always collected their price. By Wednesday evening, he had gathered $580. He needed $180 more to clear Bright Harbor's balance. Then his truck's alternator failed. The repair would cost $240 if he did it himself, and nearly twice that if he paid a shop. Mason sat in the truck outside the parts store with the estimate in his hand. Lily was asleep in the passenger seat, cheek pressed against her jacket. On the dashboard was the paper wristband she had made for Family Day. He closed his eyes. For 8 seconds, he considered using the daycare money for the alternator. Without the truck, he could not work. Without work, there would be no next payment. It was the rational choice. He hated himself for how quickly he made it. The next morning, he handed Celeste $340. She looked at the receipt. "This leaves $420. "I know. You said you'd be current." "My truck died." Celeste's jaw shifted. Behind her, a teacher was hanging paper handprints around the room for Family Day. "Mason, I have families on a waiting list. Families who pay on the first." He felt the heat return. This time he did not hide all of it. "Then give them Lily's spot." Celeste blinked. The words hit Lily before either adult could pull them back. She was standing near the cubbies. Her small face changed. Mason saw it. He hated the sound of his own voice. He crouched immediately. "Hey, no. Look at me." Lily looked at the floor. "That was me being angry, not me meaning it. Do I have to leave?" "No." He looked toward Celeste. Celeste had gone still. Mason swallowed his pride. "I'm sorry." Not to Celeste. To Lily. "I should never have said that where you could hear it." Lily nodded but did not smile. That became Mason's flaw in the story, he would later tell himself. Not that he was poor, not that he fell behind, not that he had left rescue. It was that fear sometimes made him sharp with the people closest to him. He had spent years learning to remain calm inside collapsing buildings. He was still learning how to remain calm when his daughter looked disappointed in him. Celeste watched him stand. Something in her expression softened. Then her phone buzzed. A bank alert. Bright Harbor's bridge loan review had been moved forward. The softness vanished under numbers. "Family Day is tomorrow," she said. "Nora Bell from the State Early Childhood Safety Council will be here. 2 foundation representatives are coming. I cannot have a public scene about fees." Mason stared at her. "I'm not planning one. I'm asking you not to attend unless the account is current." He lowered his voice. "I promised my daughter. And I promised 22 employees their checks would clear." There it was. Not greed. Fear. 2 exhausted adults standing on opposite sides of a number neither could afford to ignore. Mason nodded once. He'll figure it out. That afternoon, he received a call from a luxury condo. Manager whose built-in freezer had failed. Emergency rate. Cash payment. If Mason worked from 5 until 9, he could cover the balance. He accepted. At 6:40, the job changed. The failed freezer had leaked into a wall cavity. The power had to be isolated. A second appliance had been wired incorrectly by a previous contractor. Mason refused to restore the circuit until the fault was corrected. The manager became impatient. "I hired you to make it cold." "I can make it cold," Mason said. "I won't make it dangerous." "How long?" 2 more hours. He called Lily's sitter. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Then Bright Harbor called. "Celeste. Pickup was 20 minutes ago." Mason looked at the open electrical panel. His stomach dropped. "I'm on my way." "You said you were done missing pickup." "I know. You said that last month." He closed the toolbox. The condo manager stepped into his path. "You leave now, you don't get paid." Mason looked at the half-repaired freezer. $400. Exactly what he needed. Then he thought of Lily watching the daycare door. He packed his tools. "Then don't pay me." He made it to Bright Harbor 38 minutes late. Lily was sitting beside the front desk with her backpack on her knees. Celeste stood nearby with her arms crossed. Mason walked in, breathless. Lily ran to him. He held her tighter than usual. Celeste said nothing until Lily had gone to get her art folder. Then she spoke. "You left a $400 job?" Mason looked at her. "How did you know?" "The customer called. He wanted your business address so he could complain." Mason almost laughed. Celeste stared at him. For the first time, her idea of him did not fit neatly inside the word delinquent. "You could have finished," she said. "No. You needed the money." "Yes." "Then why leave?" Mason looked through the glass at Lily. "Because she needed to see me come through the door." Celeste had no answer. But the next morning, she would still enforce the policy. Understanding someone and choosing differently were not the same thing. Family Day began with bright paper decorations, folding tables, juice boxes, and the carefully cheerful disorder of small children showing adults everything at once. Mason arrived in clean work clothes because he had no suit. He had managed another $60 overnight. The remaining balance was $360. Lily wore a yellow dress Hannah had bought a year before she died. It was slightly short at the wrists. Mason had almost told her to choose something else. Then Lily said, "Mom picked this." So he ironed it. At the entrance, she gave him a new wristband. This one said, "My dad came." Mason pressed his lips together. Celeste saw them from the check-in desk. For 1 second, her face changed. Then she looked at the tablet. "Mason." He stopped. Parents moved around them. Lily's hand tightened. Celeste kept her voice low. "I'm sorry. I told you the account had to be current. I brought 60 more. That still leaves 300. 360! Her eyes flicked toward him. "You know exactly. I know exactly what I owe. Then you understand why I can't make an exception." Mason glanced into the activity room. Lily's project sat on a table beneath her name, a cardboard house with 2 figures standing outside. One figure had purple marker stars on his arms. He looked back at Celeste. "Let her go in." Celeste's face tightened. "She can stay with a teacher while you sort payment. It's Family Day, I'm aware. You're asking her to watch other kids bring their parents in while she waits outside. I am asking you to respect a policy you signed." The room around them became quieter without becoming silent. People listened while pretending not to. Mason could have argued. He could have told everyone that the owner was using a child to collect a debt. He could have raised his voice until Celeste became the villain the room expected her to be. Instead, he crouched beside Lily. "Hey!" Her eyes were wet. "Did I do something wrong?" Mason's face went still. "No." "Then why can't we go?" "Because I didn't make enough. Because the truck died. Because adults write rules when they are afraid. Because your mother is gone, and I still don't know how to be 2 people." He said none of it. "This is between grown-ups." Lily looked at Celeste. Celeste looked away. That was when a car door closed outside. A woman entered behind 2 foundation representatives. Nora Bell. Celeste straightened immediately. Her voice changed by half a degree. Warmth entered it. Professional warmth. "Nora, welcome to Bright Harbor." Nora smiled, greeted the staff, and accepted a visitor badge. Then she heard Celeste say, almost under her breath, "Your daughter can wait outside. Family Day is for accounts in good standing, Mr. Reed. We discussed this." Nora stopped. Mason felt her presence before he turned. He recognized her. Her hair was shorter now, more silver. There were fine lines beside her eyes that had not been there 6 years ago. But some faces were fixed permanently to certain moments. Smoke in a stairwell, a mother screaming a child's name, a purple bracelet. Nora looked at Mason, then at Lily, then at the purple star wristband around Mason's hand. "Before they go, Celeste," Nora said, "ask him why my daughter still keeps his name beside her bed after all these years." The room changed. Celeste's tablet lowered by an inch. Mason looked at Nora. "Please don't." His voice was not angry. That made Nora pause. She understood. He did not want rescue. Not from this. Celeste heard the word please and mistook it for embarrassment. "What is she talking about?" Mason stood. "Nothing that changes what I owe you." Nora stared at him. "Mason." He shook his head once. Lily looked between them. "You know my dad?" Nora's mouth trembled. "Yes." "How?" Mason closed his eyes for a moment. There it was, the question he had spent years arranging his life to avoid. Nora could have answered. Instead, she respected him. "For a long time," she said softly. Mason thanked her with a look. Celeste saw it. A whole history passing between 2 people without her permission. She did not like how exposed that made her feel. Not because she feared Mason's past. Because she suddenly understood she had judged a man in a room where someone else knew more. "Mr. Reed," Celeste said, trying to regain control, "we can discuss this privately." "No." The word came from Mason. Flat. Calm. Not cruel. He reached for Lily's backpack. "We're leaving." Lily looked at her cardboard house on the table. Mason saw it. He almost broke. Then a sharp electronic chirp sounded from the hallway. Once. Twice. A teacher turned toward the laundry room. The smell reached Mason half a second later. Hot insulation. Not smoke. Not yet. Mason stopped moving. Celeste noticed. What? He looked toward the corridor. Who worked on your laundry equipment? The question seemed absurd. Celeste frowned. What? The dryer. Who serviced it? This is not the time. Mason handed Lily's backpack to Nora. Take her outside. Nora did not ask why. That frightened Celeste more than anything. Mason crossed the room. The chirping came again. A staff member said, "It's probably the lint sensor. It's been doing that all week." Mason opened the laundry room door. Heat rolled out. A commercial dryer sat against the far wall. Its rear panel was warmer than it should have been. The cord conduit had a faint brown halo near the junction box. Mason did not touch it. Kill the breaker. Celeste followed him. Mason, the unit passed inspection last month. Kill the breaker, the electrician said. He turned. His voice stayed level. Celeste, kill the breaker now. Something in his tone removed argument. A teacher ran to the utility panel. The power cut. The dryer stopped. The room became quiet. Mason crouched near the baseboard. He smelled once more. Then he looked up. Get everyone outside. Celeste's face lost color. There's no smoke. There doesn't need to be yet. Nora was already moving parents toward the exit. Celeste whispered, What is it? Mason pointed to the wall behind the dryer. Heat is traveling inside the cavity. If the insulation is damaged, you may have ignition, without seeing flame in this room. You're an appliance repairman. Mason looked at her. Yes. It was not the full answer, but it was the only one he was willing to give. The evacuation took 4 minutes. Children cried because alarms eventually joined the noise. Parents gathered in the parking lot. Staff counted heads. Lily stayed with Nora. Mason remained near the entrance until firefighters arrived. He did not go inside with them. He did not touch their gear. He did not give orders. But when the company officer stepped out 10 minutes later, he looked directly at Mason. You the one who shut the circuit? Yes. Good call. The officer spoke quietly. We found charring inside the wall. Another 10, 15 minutes with that dryer running, maybe less once the vent fan kicked on. Celeste heard him. So did the foundation representatives. Her grant meeting was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Instead, she stood in the parking lot while a firefighter carried blackened insulation out through the side door. Institutional authority had replaced her polished tour. A visible consequence had taken over the morning. Celeste looked at Mason. What made you notice? He glanced at Lily. The sound changed. That's all? No. He could have explained heat transfer, resistance, conductor damage, the behavior of plastic insulation before visible smoke. He did not. He only said, enough. Nora watched him. She knew that answer too, the same way he had once known a floor was about to give way because a door had stopped closing cleanly, the same way he had carried Emma through smoke while half the building failed behind him. Celeste followed Nora's gaze. The question returned. Who was this man, and why had he worked so hard to become ordinary? The firefighters cleared the main rooms 40 minutes later. Family Day was canceled. The children were sent home. Bright Harbor's grant review, however, did not disappear. It moved to the multi-purpose room across the parking lot, a space owned by the community center and normally used for town meetings. Celeste did not ask for that. Nora did. The two foundation representatives sat at a folding table with laptops open. A fire marshal stood near the wall. 2 Bright Harbor board members had arrived after receiving emergency calls. Mason intended to leave. He had Lily's hand in his. Then Nora said, I need you to stay. He looked at her. I don't work here. No, I don't want anything. I know. Celeste stood 10 feet away. Her face was pale but controlled. Mason, she said, if this is about the balance. It isn't. Nora turned toward Celeste. That is exactly why he needs to stay. Mason's jaw tightened. Nora, she lowered her voice, you asked me not to tell Lily. I won't. But this meeting is now about safety judgment, enforcement judgment, and leadership. You are part of what happened today. Mason looked at the tables, at the fire marshal, at the people whose signatures mattered. He hated rooms like this. Not because he feared authority, because authority had once known his name. Lily squeezed his hand. Can I sit by you? He looked down. Always. So he stayed. The fire marshal began with the dryer. The service record showed a repair 3 weeks earlier. A subcontractor had replaced a terminal block but failed to secure the strain relief correctly. Repeated vibration had damaged insulation near the conductor. The damage was not visible from the front. It was not something a daycare director should have been expected to diagnose. Celeste listened carefully. Then the marshal added, "What concerns me is that staff reported repeated sensor chirps and a burnt smell on at least 2 prior occasions." Celeste looked toward her operations manager. The manager lowered her eyes. "We thought it was lint. You documented it?" A pause. "No." Celeste closed her eyes. There was no conspiracy, no villain hiding evidence. Only a tired organization where warnings had been normalized because fixing every problem cost money. Nora folded her hands. "That is the part we need to discuss." One board member asked Mason, "How did you know?" Mason answered, "Only because the question was technical. The chirp timing was irregular. A lint warning on that model repeats on a fixed interval. This one was reacting to thermal instability. Then I smelled heated wire insulation near the hall." The fire marshal glanced at him. "You familiar with that equipment?" "I repair commercial appliances." The marshal nodded. Then Nora said, "That is not the only reason he recognized danger before the rest of us." Mason looked at her. The room went quiet enough to hear the ventilation fan in the ceiling. Nora's eyes moved to Lily. "May I tell them the part that belongs to me?" Mason understood the distinction. Not his whole past. Her story. He nodded once. Nora looked around the room. 6 years ago, my daughter Emma was 8 years old. There was an apartment fire on Halpern Avenue. A stairwell failed while she and her brother were trapped above it. Mason looked at the tabletop. Lily watched his face. Nora continued. Metro Urban Search and Rescue Task Force 6 entered that building after the city company lost access to the upper floor. Celeste's eyes moved slowly toward Mason. Nora did not dramatize the next sentence. She did not need to. "Mason Reed carried my daughter out." No one spoke. "He was a rescue specialist and EMT," Nora said. "He served 12 years. He trained younger teams in structural collapse recognition. He received a state commendation after Halpern Avenue and refused every interview request connected to it." One of the foundation representatives looked at Mason's work clothes as if seeing them for the first time. Nora's voice softened. "My daughter slept with hospital lights on for almost 2 years. She kept a card beside her bed with the names of 3 people, she said, had come through the smoke. Mason's name is still on it." Celeste's lips parted. Mason did not look victorious. He looked tired. That mattered, because there was nothing satisfying about being remembered for the worst day of someone else's life. Lily whispered, "Daddy?" Mason turned toward her. "You saved her?" He took a breath. "I helped." Nora's eyes filled. "You carried her down 3 flights after the landing collapsed." Mason looked back at Nora. "I wasn't alone." "No," Nora said. "You never say you were." The room stayed still. Celeste's tablet rested face down beside her. For the first time all day, she had nothing to hold between herself and another person. "I didn't know," she said. Mason looked at her. "You didn't." Celeste swallowed. "I thought you were." She stopped. He waited. The sentence was too ugly to finish, honestly. Irresponsible. Unreliable. A parent who always had a reason. Mason understood without hearing it. His voice was even. "You didn't know who I was." Celeste's eyes lowered. Mason continued. "But that wasn't the problem." She looked up. "You decided what Lily deserved because of what I owed you." The words landed harder than an accusation because he did not raise his voice. "You had every right to collect the balance," he said. "You had every right to end our contract if I couldn't pay." "But she didn't sign the contract." Celeste's face flushed. Mason looked at the board. "She's 6. Silence again. The ventilation fan clicked off. Now the room was even quieter. Nora asked Celeste, "Was exclusion from Family Day written in your payment policy?" Celeste hesitated. "No." "Was it approved by your board?" "No." "Was it communicated to families when they enrolled?" "No." Celeste's operations manager shifted in her chair. The fire marshal closed his folder. Nora did not smile. There was no pleasure in the moment. "That was important too. This grant program is not designed to reward perfect organizations," Nora said. "It is designed to support organizations capable of safe correction. Today we saw 2 failures, one in equipment escalation, one in judgment." Celeste's eyes filled, but she held her posture. "I understand. Do you?" Nora's question was not cruel. It was exact. Celeste looked at Lily. The yellow dress, the paper wristband. "My dad came." Her expression changed. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I do now," one board member asked. "What happens to the grant?" Nora closed the application folder. "The award is suspended pending corrective review." Celeste closed her eyes. There was the consequence. Not destruction, not revenge, a suspension. Time, conditions, a chance to change. Nora continued. Bright Harbor will need a documented maintenance escalation system, a revised family debt policy that separates financial enforcement from child participation, staff training, and board oversight for hardship cases. Celeste nodded. We'll do it. Nora looked at Mason. Mr. Reed, the council can reimburse you for consulting on the equipment review. Mason shook his head. No. Celeste looked at him. You just saved this building from a fire. The fire department did that. You stopped the dryer. I was standing there. Nora almost smiled. There was the old Mason, refusing to let competence become theater. One foundation representative said, you could name a fee. Mason looked at Lily, then at Celeste. I have one condition. The room waited. Celeste's shoulders stiffened. Mason said, don't erase what I owe. She blinked. I'm sorry? I owe it. I'll pay it. Nora studied him. Mason continued. But if Bright Harbor stays open after this review, no kid gets put outside a celebration because their parent is late on money. Celeste's eyes shone. You have my word. Mason nodded. That's enough. Lily tugged his sleeve. Can we go now? Mason smiled. Yeah. They reached the door before Celeste called his name. Mason. He turned. She crossed the room. For the first time, there was no tablet in her hand. I'm sorry. He waited. She looked at Lily. I'm sorry to both of you. Lily stared at her. Celeste crouched. You didn't do anything wrong. Lily looked at Mason. He nodded. She looked back at Celeste. Okay. Children forgave differently than adults. Not because they forgot faster. Because they had not yet learned to protect pride with punishment. 3 weeks later, Bright Harbor reopened after electrical repairs and a voluntary safety review. The grant remained suspended for another month. Celeste used the delay to change more than the paperwork required. She created a hardship committee that included one teacher, one parent, and one board member. Families behind on payment received private meetings, not public consequences. Maintenance concerns had to be logged and escalated within 24 hours. She also sold the expensive digital check-in package she had bought the year before and used the money to create a small emergency tuition fund. It was not enough to save everyone from everything. No policy could do that. But it was a beginning. Mason paid the final $300 6 Fridays later. Celeste tried once to waive it. He refused. You said don't erase it, she reminded him. I meant it. She handed him the receipt. Then she said, I used to think exceptions destroyed fairness. Mason folded the receipt. And now? I think sometimes fairness is knowing what the rule is for. He nodded. That was as close to agreement as they needed. Nora visited their apartment the following Sunday. She did not come with cameras, certificates, or a check. She brought Emma. Emma Bell was 14 now. Tall, serious, and embarrassed by how quickly she cried when Mason opened the door. For a moment, he did not recognize the child he had carried. Then she lifted her left sleeve. Around her wrist was a thin purple bracelet. Not the original hospital band. A replacement. On the inside, written in tiny black letters, were 3 names. Mason's was one of them. He looked away. Emma said, My mom told me you don't like being thanked. Mason cleared his throat. She exaggerates. No, she doesn't. Lily appeared beside him. Are you the girl Dad saved? Mason started to correct her. Emma answered first. Your dad helped me get home. Lily considered that. Then she took Emma's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen table. I made him better in my drawing. Mason laughed despite himself. They ate grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. No gala. No award ceremony. No wealthy audience waiting to applaud. Just 2 girls talking over each other while Nora sat near the window and Mason refilled water glasses. At one point, Nora touched the edge of the table. Hannah would be proud of you. Mason stopped. For years, people had praised the wrong things. His rescues, his composure, his ability to walk into danger. Nobody understood that the hardest thing he had done was leave that identity behind and accept a smaller life. Without feeling like a smaller man, he looked toward Lily. She'd tell me I still forget to buy milk. Nora smiled. She'd probably be right. That evening, after Nora and Emma left, Lily taped a new drawing to the refrigerator. This one had 3 figures: a tall man, a little girl with purple hair, and a woman drawn in pale yellow above them. Not quite on the ground and not quite in the sky. Mason stood in front of it for a long time. Lily came beside him. "I put Mom where she can see us." Mason's throat tightened. "Good spot." "Dad? Yeah? Were you a hero before?" He looked down at her. Then he knelt so they were eye level. "I was a guy with a job." "That's not what Miss Nora said." Mason smiled. "Ms. Nora is biased." Lily thought about it. "Are you a hero now?" Mason looked at the drawing. At the receipt from Bright Harbor tucked beneath the strawberry magnet. At the purple star wristband still looped around his watch. He could have given her a beautiful answer. Instead, he gave her the true one. "I'm trying to be your dad." Lily hugged him. "That's better." And in the end, that was the part of the story no grant committee could measure. People often confuse status with worth because status is easier to see. A title sits on a door. A uniform announces authority. Money prints itself in clothing, buildings, schedules, and the confidence to say no without explaining why. But worth often hides in quieter places. In the parent who leaves money on the table to keep a promise. In the worker who notices the sound everyone else dismisses. In the person who once carried strangers through danger and now measures success by whether his child sees him arrive. Mason Reed did not become valuable when Nora Bell said his name. He had been valuable before anyone in that room knew it. And Celeste Harrington did not become wrong because she enforced a debt. She became wrong when the debt became more visible to her than the child standing beside it. The lesson was not that rules do not matter. It was that rules are supposed to serve people, not replace the work of seeing them. Sometimes the person standing outside the door is not asking to be treated like someone important. Sometimes he is only asking you to remember that his child already is.